Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Memhe, Daf 45. No. Daf Mem Daled, Daf 44 of Masechta Sukkah. Friends, what does Daf Mem Daled talk about? We continue our discussion trying to figure out if maybe Arave, maybe when the seventh day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos, maybe you should be able to do the Arave procession on Shabbos in Eretz Yisrael, where they know about what day of the proper day of Rosh Chodesh, and therefore they can know for sure that the seventh day is really the seventh day. Maybe in Eretz Yisrael they should do the Arave procession on Shabbos, if the seventh day of Sukkot is Shabbos. So we're going to kind of continue in that discussion, and then we're going to basically have a few other discussions about Arava, so technical things, the Raisa, the Rabbanon, Minig Nevi'im, Yesod Nevi'im. We'll get there soon. We talk about is there a size, is there a shear, an amount that the Arava needs to be when it comes to the mitzvah of Arava. Tomorrow we're going to get to a Mishnah about exactly what the mitzvah was of Arava, but basically they would walk around the Mizbeach with it and then kind of stand it up against the Mizbeach. That is kind of part of what the discussion is that we're in the middle of exactly what is the mitzvah of Arava. Is it walking around with it? Is it standing it up next to the Mizbeach? It would appear in the end it's kind of both, but alright. And then we have some interesting anecdotes, very interesting anecdotes between Evo, who was the father of Rav, and Rebbe Elazar Reb Tzaddik. Very interesting how they would have overlapped. I mean, just generation. I mean, Rav was like the first Amora, so his father was, I guess, the generation of the last Tanoim, and Rebbe Elazar Reb Tzaddik wasn't exactly at the end of the Tanoim. So it's interesting that Rav's father Evo would overlap with Rebbe Elazar Reb Tzaddik. But Rebbe Elazar Reb Tzaddik's father, Reb Tzaddik, was around during the second Beis Hamikdash. So it's interesting to think that Rav's father would have overlapped with somebody whose father was alive during the second Beis Hamikdash. But anyways, alright. Like, Rav Tzaddik was around during the time of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was like the Rebbe of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, who were the Rebbe of Rabbi Akiva, who was the Rebbe of like Rabbi Yehuda in that generation, who were, the Rebbe of Rebbe, and like only in that generation was Rav's father, Evo. So, very interesting. Friends, let's get started over here. We're on Daf Min Gimel Amud Beis. We have a little bit of work to do. So, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we were in the middle of trying to figure out, maybe when the seventh day of Sukkot falls out on a Shabbos, so you should be able to do the mitzvah of Arava in Eretz Yisrael, where they know about the Rosh Chodesh, right? Meaning, the way that Rosh Chodesh works is that back then, you would, at the time of the Mishnah, people would see that there's a new moon, and that means that the month has begun, and witnesses would go to Jerusalem and talk about that they saw the moon, and they would say, okay, Mekudesh, it's a new month. And then messengers would go out and spread the word that, okay, it's the new month, and that's important because, let's say the beginning of Tishrei, 15 days later is going to be Sukkot, so you have to know when day one is, when the new moon is, right, which is day one. So that's important. So in Eretz Yisrael, they're already able to know, by the time Sukkot comes at least, when day one was, so that they can calculate properly when the first day of Sukkot is, and of course when the seventh day of Sukkot is. But in Chutz La'aretz, where the messengers, by Sukkot time, they're not going to know when the first day of Tishrei was declared back in Jerusalem. So they have, right, that's why in Chutz La'aretz, even to this day, we still have 2 days of Yontif, right, the Sfeika Diyoma, because we're not exactly sure which day is which. It could be one of 2 days, right? Depending on if the previous month, if Elul was 30 days or 29 days, based on when the new moon appeared. So, in Chutz La'aretz, we're not exactly sure which is the first day of Sukkot and which is the seventh day of Sukkot. So, since we're not exactly sure which day is which, so then we cannot, right? So the Arava would not be Docha Shabbos in Chutz La'aretz. But the Kasha is, what about in Eretz Yisrael, where they know that day 7 of Sukkot is really day 7? So maybe then Arava, the mitzvah of Arava should be Doche Shabbos in Eretz Yisrael. Zeicher LeMikdash. Right? As a remembrance to the fact that Arava was Midorais in the Beis HaMikdash. So to remember that Arava was Midorais in the Beis HaMikdash, nowadays in Eretz Yisrael, where they know that day 7 is really day 7, if Shabbos falls out on day 7, so Arava would be Docha Shabbos. That's the kashus. And then the follow-up question became, well, it depends what the mitzvah of Arava really is. If the mitzvah of Arava is to, walk around holding the Arava, so then, Eina Chinami. Yeah, I understand right? So nowadays, you could do that. You could walk around with an Arava, and maybe that should be Docha Shabbos. But if the mitzvah of Arava was that they would take an Arava and stand it up against the Mizbeach in the Beis HaMikdash, well, we don't have a Mizbeach in the Beis HaMikdash anymore, so it's just, Arava isn't really Shaykh anymore, so there's nothing to talk about. So, that's what we're trying to figure out. So Rav Yosef was of the opinion that the mitzvah of Arava is to just stand it up against the Mizbeach, in which case it's irrelevant essentially nowadays, because we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, we don't have a Mizbeach, and therefore Arava is a non-starter. It's not going to be Docha Shabbos because there's really nothing to do. However, Eisvei, where are we? We are on Daf Mem Gimel Amud Beis, about 12 lines from the bottom. The last word on the line is Eisvei. Next line, Lulav doche es hashabos b'tchilaso v'arav b'sofo. So we have a brayso that says that Lulav is going to be doche Shabbos in the Mistama in the Beis HaMikdash when Shabbos falls out on the first day of Sukkot, right? Or the other way around. If the first day of Sukkot falls out to be on a Shabbos, so then Lulav is doche Shabbos b'tchilaso, fine, on the first day, v'arav b'sofo. And when the seventh day of Sukkot falls out on a Shabbos, so then the mitzvah of Arava is going to be Docha Shabbos. Fine. Now, Pamachas choshvi shel Arava lios b'Shabbos. Now, one time, the seventh day of Sukkot fell out to be on a Shabbos. V'eviu marbios shel Arava me'erev Shabbos. So they brought the Aravis that they were going to use for the mitzvah of Arava from already before Shabbos. So from Erev Shabbos, they brought these Aravis. V'nichum ba'azara, and they left the Aravis in the Azara. Okay? But from before Shabbos. V'kirba and Baitusin. Wah. So in the Baitusin, Rashi says the Baitusin are basically the Tzedukim. So now, as we have noted, the mitzvah of Arava is not explicitly written in the Torah. And therefore, of course, the Tzedukim, if it's not explicitly written in the Torah, they won't hear of it. And therefore they said, what are these people wasting their time with this Arava mitzvah? It's a nothing, it's not a mitzvah. So they found this Arava stash that they had brought from before Shabbos that they were going to use for the mitzvah of Arava on Shabbos. So you know what they did? Nudniks. They took the Aravis and they put them under a rock, because they know these Prushim, these other people, they hold of the halach of Muksa, which we also don't hold of. So all we have to do is take these Aravis, put them under a rock, and then they're not going to touch them because it's Muksa. And they were making fun of the Prushim. Hey, what are they doing with these Aravis? They're wasting their time. And then they took the Aravis, put it under a rock, and they said now they're not going to be able to get the Aravis because the rock is Muksa. But what ended up happening was, the next day, there were some Prushim, right? Prushim are like the sort of competition, Prushim is like Rabbinic Judaism, let's say, and Tzedukim is like the people who don't believe in Torah Sheba'al Peh. So those are the Tzedukim. So the Prushim, so the next day, the Prushim who do believe in Torah Sheba'al Peh, and they do believe that the mitzvah of Arava is in fact a mitzvah, so they saw that these Aravis were under a rock. Now these people were Amei Haaretz. They weren't particularly learned, so they weren't so familiar with the halachas of Muksa. All they noticed is wait a second, this is weird. The Aravis are under a rock. So Vishamtu mitachas avonim ve'vium, period. So they took them out from under the rock because they didn't realize that there was anything wrong with that. So they took out the aravas. And then the Kohanim came and they took the aravas and they put them next to the mizbeach. Because the baitusim, these students of baitus, that Rashi says are tzedukim, they didn't realize that chibut arava is doches hashabbos. That Rashi says chibut. Actually, Rashi doesn't say it here. I think he says it on the next daf. Actually, but basically the waving of the arava, the tzedukim did not hold or held that the shaking of the arava was nonsense. It was not a mitzvah. So Amma benetilu tiyufta. So we see from the fact that we call it chibut arava, which is basically taking the arava, so that must mean that what's the mitzvah of arava? The mitzvah of the arava is taking it. And if it's taking it, we could do that nowadays. And if we could do it nowadays, well then, velenidchu, then we should say that nowadays, in Eretz Yisrael at least, where we know which day when we know that the 7th day of Sukkot is really the 7th day of Sukkot, if it falls out on Shabbos, it should be Docha Shabbos, Zeicher LeMikdash. So, and for the Gemara, so the Gemara answers, well, since in Bavel, we are not going to be Docha Shabbos for the Arava, since in Bavel we have the Sveika Diyoma, we're not sure which day is in fact the 7th day of Sukkot. So therefore, since in Bavel, we're not going to do the mitzvah of Arava when the 7th day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos. So also in Eretz Yisrael, they don't do the mitzvah of Arava when the 7th day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos. But 1 second. But what about when it comes to lulav? We had said on yesterday's daf that when the first day of Sukkot falls out on a Shabbos, so in Eretz Yisrael, when they know that it's in fact the first day of Sukkot for sure, so we said that the mitzvah of lulav would be doche Shabbos, right? Right? We had said, and that's why we have two Mishnayos. One Mishnah says that they would bring the lulavim to the Beis Hamikdash, to Har Habayis, before Shabbos, and the other Mishnah says that they would bring the lulavim to the synagogue. So we said that the synagogue was talking about when there's no Beis Hamikdash, so they bring it to the synagogue. I.e., that nowadays, when the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos, in Eretz Yisrael, where they know that the first day of Sukkot is really the first day of Sukkot, so the mitzvah of lulav is Docha Shabbos. So when it comes to lulav, even though in Chutz La'aretz in Bavel, we would not take the lulav if the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos, since we can't know for sure that it's really the first day of Sukkot. Yet in Eretz Yisrael, they do take the lulav. So why don't we say the same thing by Arava? That when the 7th day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos, let's say that while in Bavel we do not do the mitzvah of Arava, in Eretz Yisrael they should, because they know that it's really the 7th day. Amr ledidu nami lodachu. Lodachi. So the Gemara answers, 1 second. Actually, in Eretz Yisrael, when the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos, they do not take the lulav. They do not take the lulav in Eretz Yisrael when the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos. But then what do you do with these two brises, or really Mishnayos? Oh, nice. What's this? Right, Tanan. Good. The Tanan Chada, because one Mishnah says, Kol ha-molichnes luveim lahar habayis. What, right? I think the Mishnah at the beginning of, the Mishnah at the beginning of our parak says, of this parak, the 4th parak, says that everybody would bring their lulav to Har Habayis, to the Beis Hamikdash, basically. With Tanan Idach, we have another Mishnah that says, Leveis HaKnesses, that they would bring their lulav to the synagogue. And we answered, how come one says the Har Habayis, one says the synagogue? Kamas manche Beis Hamikdash kaim, kamas manche ein Beis Hamikdash kaim. The answer is, well, it depends. When there was a Beis Hamikdash, they brought the lulavim to Har Habayis, and when there was no Beis Hamikdash, so they brought the lulavim to the synagogue. But either way, they were doing the mitzvah of lulav. When the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos, they were doing the mitzvah of lulav in Eretz Yisrael. Lo, that's not the correct way to answer to understand these two Mishnayos. How come one says Harabayis and the other one says the synagogue? Both Mishnayos are talking about when there was a Beis HaMikdash. And the way to understand these two Mishnayos is that when in the Beis HaMikdash, so of course they would bring the lulavim to Harabayis before Shabbos. If you were outside of the Beis HaMikdash, so then if you weren't in the Beis HaMikdash, so then you would be bringing your lulav to the synagogue before Shabbos. However, nowadays, even in Eretz Yisrael, we do not take the lulav when the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos. Abai says to Rabbi Rabba, the Girsa of Argumar says Rabba, but Agos Habach changes it to Rabba. I like that Girsa. Abai Rabba says Abai to Rabba. My shna lulav davdina le shiva zeichel mikdash, umay shna arave de lo avdina le shiva zeichel mikdash. Abai asks his Rabbi Rabba. He says, why do nowadays we take the lulav all 7 days of Sukkot zeichel mikdash, just like in the Beis HaMikdash they would take it all 7 days. So nowadays we take it right. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says you should take the lulav every day. Okay, how come we don't do the same thing for arave? In the Beis HaMikdash, there's a mitzvah of Arave every day of Sukkot. So why don't we, nowadays, as a remembrance to the Beis HaMikdash, why don't we also do the mitzvah of Arave every single day? We only take the Hoshaina, we only take the Arave on the 7th day, on Hoshana Rabbah. On the 7th day of Sukkot, so we take the Arave. But we don't do it every day. So Rabbi says, it's because every day you're Yotzei the mitzvah of Arave when you pick up your Daled Minim. When you pick up your Daled Minim, one of the Daled Minim, of course, is the Arave. So by taking your Daled Minim, so Mimele, you're taking the Arave. Omerle. So Abaye says, so Abaye says, yeah, but when you pick up your Daled Minim, you're doing that to be Yotzei the mitzvah of Daled Minim, of Lulav, not to be Yotzei the mitzvah of Arave. And if you're going to say, yeah, well, what you have to do is you have to pick it up once for the mitzvah with the intention of Lulav, and then pick it up a second time with the intention of Arave. It says Abai, but the fact of the matter is, in practice, nobody does that. In which case, in practice, nobody's doing the mitzvah of Arave. How come? Why don't we say that like Lulav, the mitzvah of Arava nowadays is all 7 days as a remembrance to the Beis HaMikdash. Omer of Zvid Mishmei de Rave, so if Zvid tries to answer this in the name of Rave, and he says, well, Lulav de Oraisa of Dinan Shiva Zeichel HaMikdash, well, Lulav is a mitzvah mida Oraisa, L'kachtem lochem b'yom harishin. So Lulav is a mitzvah de Oraisa, so we do it all 7 days, Zeichel HaMikdash. Arave de Rabbanon, whereas the Arave is only a mitzvah de Rabbanon, lo avdinan lo shiva zeichel hamikdash. And because Arave is only midei Rabbanon, so we don't have this zeichel hamikdash to do the mitzvah of Arave for all 7 days. But 1 second, Laman, whose opinion is that Arave is midei Rabbanon? We've never seen that before. Yilem el Abba Shol. If you're going to say it's the opinion of Abba Shol that we saw, where did we see that? On Daf Lamed Daled, 10 days ago. Ha'omer Arvei Nachal Ksiv Shtayim. But Abba Shol's opinion was that it says Arvei Nachal. Arvei is plural. It says by the Aravis Arvei Nachal. Arvei Nachal is plural. Achas lelulav, achas lemikdash. To say that you use Aravis in the lulav, and you also use the Aravis in the Beis HaMikdash for the mitzvah of Arave. So we see that according to Abba Shol, Arave is midoraisa. Ilu Rabbanon. And if we're saying according to the rabbis who argued on Abba Shol's interpretation of Arvei Nachal, Hilchsa Gmirelo. They learn out that Arava is in the Beis HaMikdash, Halach LaMoshe Misinai. Damar Basim Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Nechunya Ish Bikas Beis Charson Eser Netios Arava V'Nisu Chamayim Halach LaMoshe Misinai. As we saw the other day, that says Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Asi, the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the name of Rabbi Nechunya Ish Bikas Beis Charson, that Eser Netios talks about basically plowing your field. If it's like 50 saw by 50 saw, and there are 10 Netios in there, you're allowed to plow the entire field. Seder. I think I was up until Shvius, I think. And the Arave, as well as the mitzvah of Arave in the Beis HaMikdash, V'nisu Chamayim, and the fact that they would do the water libations with the Korban Tamid Shel Shachar in the Beis HaMikdash on Sukkot. Halach l'Moshe Misinai. All of these are halach l'Moshe Misinai. And halach l'Moshe Misinai is the status of the Oraisa. So I don't understand. How is Rav Zvid saying in the name of Rava that since Arava is Midar Abanon, we don't do it Zeichel Mikdash? Who says that Arava is Midar Abanon? Nobody says Arava is Midar Abanon. Ella, Rav Zvid Mishmei de Rave, rather says Rav Zvid in the name of Rave, Lulav de Islay Iker Me'atorah, Lulav, which has, where am I? Lulav de Islay Iker Me'atorah Begvulin, Lulav, which has sort of an aspect Mida Oraisa outside of the Beis HaMikdash, Avdina Le Shiva Zeichel HaMikdash. So we do it for 7 days as a remembrance to the Beis HaMikdash. Arava de Leis La Iker Minatorah Begvulin, Lo Avdina Shiva Zeichel HaMikdash. But Arave, which doesn't have any kind of aspect outside of the Beis HaMikdash, we don't do it 7 days Zeichel HaMikdash. What does this mean? It means that, of course, Lulav, in the Beis HaMikdash, there was a mitzvah to the mitzvah of Lulav all 7 days of Sukkot. However, even outside of the Beis HaMikdash, there was also mitzvah of Lulav, at least on the first day. So therefore, when it comes to Lulav, which there's a mitzvah of Lulav outside of the Beis HaMikdash, i.e. on the first day of Sukkot. So because there's already a mitzvah of Lulav outside of the Beis HaMikdash, so nowadays, when of course we're outside of the Beis HaMikdash, as a remembrance to the Beis HaMikdash, we do it for all 7 days. However, Arave, which was entirely limited in scope to the Beis HaMikdash, there's no mitzvah midoraisa of Arava outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So we don't do a 7-day Zeichel HaMikdash, remembrance to the Mikdash outside, nowadays when of course we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, so we don't do a 7-day Zeichel HaMikdash. Okay, fine. Omer Rish Lakish says Rish Lakish K'anim Bali Mumin Nichnosim Bein Ulam V'Lamazbech K'dei Lotzis Ba'arava. Says Rish Lakish that Kohanim who are blemished, who have a mum and are unable to serve in the Beis HaMikdash, nonetheless Nichnosim Bein Ulam V'Lamazbech K'dei Lotzis Ba'arava. They can go between the Ulam and the Mizbeach in order to be yotze the mitzvah of Arava. What does this mean? So, of course, we know what Bein Ulam V'Lamazbech is from Masechta Yoma, that between the Mizbeach in the Azorah and the and the entrance to the Heichal, the Ulam. So it says Rish Lakish that when they would walk around the Mizbeach with the Aravis, so Memele, at a certain point, when you get to the western side of the Mizbeach, you're going to be between the Ulam and the Mizbeach. Now in general, Kohanim who have a mum would be unable to go in the area between the Ulam and the Mizbeach. But it says Rish Lakish that in the context of the mitzvah of Arave, so let's read that again. Rish Lakish Kohanim Bali Mumin, that if you have Kohanim who are blemished, who in general are not allowed to go between the Ulam and the Mizbeach, but Nichnosin Bein Ulam V'La Mizbeach, they are allowed to go between the Ulam and the Mizbeach, K'dei Lotzis Ba'arave, in order to be Yotzei the mitzvah of Arave. Omer Rabbi Yochanan Mi'amr. So now Rabbi Yochanan says, who said this? And what the assumption is right now is what it means is, who says that there's a mitzvah of Arava? Right? Because he says Lotzeis. Right? Rish Lakish says, in order to be Yotzei, K'dei Lotzeis Ba'arava, to be Yotzei the mitzvah of Arava. Rabbi Yochanan says, what do you mean Yotzei the mitzvah of Arava? Who says that there's a mitzvah of Arava? Mi'amra. To which the Gemara says, what? What do you mean? Why would Rabbi Yochanan be asking if there's a mitzvah of Arava or not? Ha'iu Amar. Rabbi Yochanan himself is the one who says that there certainly is a mitzvah of Arava. The Amar Basi Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Nechunu Ish Bekaz Beis Chors and Eser Netias Arava V'Nisu Chamayim Alach L'Moshe Misinai. It's Rabbi Yochanan who says that Arava is Alach L'Moshe Misinai. So obviously there's a mitzvah of Arava. No, Elami Amra B'Netila. What Rabbi Yochanan is asking is, who says that the mitzvah of Arava is to pick it up and walk around the Mizbeach with it? Dilma b'zikifa. Maybe you just have to take it and lean it against the Mizbeach. Mi'amar b'ba'ali mumim, dilma b'tmimim. Who says that ba'ali mumim are allowed to, take part in the mitzvah of Arava? Maybe it's only unblemished Kohanim who could take who could participate in the mitzvah of arava. Okay? That's what he's asking. Itmar, we stated Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Alright? We have machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Chad Omer, arava yesod neviim. One of them says that the arava is a yesod neviim. Says Rashi, that the final neviim, Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, they made takonis. Says Rashi, what does he say? Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, shayu mimisakne takonis yisod ba'anshe knesses hagdola, that they would make takonis, enactments, as part of the anshe knesses hagdola. And therefore, one of the opinions, either Rabbi Yochanan or Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, is that it was one of the enactments of the Nevi'im that there's this mitzvah of arava. V'chad omer arava minig Nevi'im. And the other opinion is that the mitzvah of arava is not actually a takana of the Nevi'im, but a minig. The nafkamina is, would you make a bracha on it? If it's a takana, if it's an enactment, it's basically a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, so then you would make a bracha on it. But if it's only a minig, that the rabbi said, look, we do this mitzvah of this, I guess, arava thing, but it's not necessarily a mitzvah, it's not an enactment, it's not a takana, so then you wouldn't make a bracha on it. Okay, fine. This time, Rabbi Yochanan who the Amar Yisod Nevi'im, so it makes sense to say that Rabbi Yochanan's opinion is that it's the this enactment of the Nevi'im. The Amar Babao, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Babao says the name of Rabbi Yochanan, arava Yisod Nevi'imu, Tistayim. Because Rabbi Babao says the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that arava is an enactment of the Nevi'im. So we see that it's Rabbi Yochanan's opinion that arava is the enactment of the Nevi'im, whereas it must be Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi who says that it's a minig of the Nevi'im. Amar le Reb Zeir le Babao. Now Reb Zeir says to Babao, Mi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Achi? I don't understand. Would Rabbi Yochanan really say that arava is an enactment of the Nevi'im? Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Ibn Chuni Ish Bikaz Beis Chorsin Esun Etir Sarava V'Nisu Chamayim Alach Moshe Misinai. But Rabbi Yochanan says that arava is alach l'Moshe Misinai, not a yesod Nevi'im. So ishtoimim k'sha'achada. So Rabbi Bo was quiet for a while. V'Amar, and then he said, Shachatchum v'chazu v'yastum. So Rabbi Bo says, okay, what must be the answer is that yes, arava is alach l'Moshe Misinai. Yes, Mida Oraisa, there's this mitzvah of arava. But in Bavel, they forgot certain things, as we learned on the Afchaf, right? That, Allah b'nei Reb Chia v'yastum. Was that what it was? Or maybe Hillel Abavli? Whatever it was, right? That certain halachas were forgotten and people had to come back and remind the people of them. So Rabbi Bo says, look, yes, arava is alach l'Moshe Misinai. But when after the exile in Bavel, they forgot certain things. So they had to then make a Yesod on Nevi'im. Chag Zechariah Malachi had to then remind the people of the Arav, and that's what it means that it's an enactment of the Nevi'im. But would Rabbi Yochanan really say this? Would Rabbi Yochanan really say that in Bavel they forgot about Arava and they had to be reminded? Rabbi Yochanan dilchon amri dilhoni. Rabbi Yochanan says in a story at the end of Baba Kama with Rav Kahana who came to Eretz Yisrael and he was answering all sorts of questions, and Rabbi Yochanan says, wow, he was surprised. He says, dilchon amri. He said to the people of Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yochanan of course was in Eretz Yisrael, he said to the people of Eretz Yisrael, wow, I assumed that here in Eretz Yisrael, you, the people in front of me, you, were the sort of leaders of Torah knowledge because you were never exiled, so you kind of kept the tradition. You didn't have anything to make you forget. You didn't have like a traumatic, tragic exile experience. But Dilhoni, now when I see Rav Kahana who came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, and I see what a Gaon he is, how he knows everything, and he's reminding me of halachas, I see that really in Bavel is really where Torah is at and Torah is thriving. So we see that Rabbi Yochanan actually very much valued the Torah study that was happening in Bavel. So how could it be that it's Rabbi Yochanan who's saying that in Bavel they kind of were unorganized and forgot the halacha of Arava and the Nevi'im had to remind them. So lokasha, it's no problem. Kan b'mikdash, kan b'gvulin. So actually, no, what it means is that in the Beis HaMikdash, when Rabbi Yochanan says that Arava is halacha l'Moshe Misinai, that's in the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash, there's a mitzvah d'oraisa halacha l'Moshe Misinai of Arava. But b'gvulin, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, so it's a Yesod Nevi'im. It's an enactment of the Nevi'im that you would take the Arava outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Fine. Omer Reb Ami, says Reb Ami, Arava tzri chashir. Okay, Reb Ami says that the Arava, for the mitzvah of Arava, needs a certain amount. Now we already said that the Hadassim and Aravos and the Oshaina in the Lulav need to be 3 tfachim. But we're saying over here that the Arava for the mitzvah of Arava also needs a certain amount. We haven't yet said what this amount is. And you have to take it on its own. Only in Arava, nothing else. And you can't be Yotzei the Chiyuv of the mitzvah of Arava you cannot use the Arava in your Lulav. You need to have just a branch of Arava. I don't understand. The first thing that Rabbi Ami said was that you have to chop the Arava by itself with nothing else. And then he says, and you can't be Yotzei the mitzvah of Arava with the Arava in your Lulav. Isn't that Muvan Me'elav? Isn't that self-explanatory? Once he already said it in that the Arava must be taken alone, obviously, then he can't use the Arava that's together with his Lulav Adasim and Adasim and Esrik. Ma'udetema, I may have thought to say, well, I may have thought to say, look, if you picked up your Lulav once and put it down, and now he wants to be the Yotze, the mitzvah of Arava, so he should take an Arava by itself. But if he picked up the Lulav, put it down, and then picked up the Lulav a second time, and now we want to know, was he technically speaking Yotze the mitzvah? Maybe I would say, yeah, okay. Meaning, he should have just picked up an Arava by itself, but he didn't. He picked up the Lulav twice that had the Arava as part of it. So maybe I would say, okay, fine, that works. Kamash Malan, that no, it doesn't work. Even if you put it down even if you picked up the Lulav, put it down and picked it up a second time, it does not work. You have to do the Arava by itself. Whereas Rav Chizda says the name of Rabbi Yitzchak that actually, no, a person can be Yotzei's chiyuv of Arava with the Arava that's in his Lulav, that is also acceptable. We said that in Arava it needs to be a certain size. How much is that size? Right? So we said that the Arava with the Lulav needs to be 3 tfachim. How big does the Arava for the mitzvah of Arava have to be? So Rav Nachman says, look, you have to have 3 Arava twigs that have leaves on them. Alright? Rav Shesha says you can even have 1 leaf and 1 twig. To which the Gemara says, what? Just, you need 1 leaf and 1 twig? How are you going to see the leaf? I mean, if you're holding 1 leaf, that's what you need for the mitzvah of Arava? No, what it means is that you can have 1 twig that has 1 leaf on it, and that's enough for the mitzvah of Arava. Okay, sounds good to me. What do you want me to tell you? Omer Ivo. So it says Ivo or Avo. Now, Avo was the father of Rav. I was before Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok, which I pointed out in the intro, is very interesting. I mean, I don't really understand the generations over here, but between Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok, his generation, and Avo seems to be like a lot of generations. I mean, Avo was a generation of like Rebbe Mistame, and so then you would need the generation of like Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir and friends, and with the generation of Rabbi Akiva. And then the generation, already like that generation, I guess, Rabbi Akiva, but also the generation beforehand, like Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok was probably around there. Because Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok, his father, was already the time of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the Rebbe of Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer, which was already the Zman Beis HaMikdash. I don't know, maybe like Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok was like, I don't know, a young son of Reb Tzadok, and maybe Ivo was like young at the time. Maybe like Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok was already older at that time. But there's like a few generations. I guess it's not so insane, but there was like a few generations between them probably. So Amar Ivo says, Ivo, I was before Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok. Va'aisi ha'u gavra arava kame. And somebody came with an arava. Shakil chavit v'lo barich. He took it, and Rashi says chavit means to wave it. So he waved it around, and he didn't make a bracha. Kosaver minig neviimu, because he must hold that it's a minig neviim, not a yesod neviim. Right? It's outside of the Beis Hamikdash, and he held that it was a minig of the neviim, and therefore you don't make a bracha on it. Ivo v'chizkiya b'nei barte de Rav. Ivo and Chizkiya were the grandchildren of Rav, the sons of Rav's daughter. Meaning Rav's father was Evo, but also apparently had a grandson, Evo. Aisu Arave Lekame, they brought before Rav and Arave, Lekame de Rav, Chavit v'lo barich. He also waved it around and didn't make a bracha on it, Kosaver minig neviimu, because he holds that outside of the Beis Hamikdash, Arave is just a minig. Omer Evo says, Evo, Avokim Lekame de Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok. Another time I was in front of Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok. Also Lekame Ahu Gavra, and a certain fellow came before Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok, Omar Le, and he said to Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok, Kiryasa Isli, I own like cities, villages. Karmaya Isli, and I own vineyards. Zesaya Isli, and I own olive groves. Vasu b'nei Kiryasa, and the people of the villages come, and they hoe around in the vineyards, and this is during Shemitah, Shvius, right, during Shemitah. So what this fellow is saying, that look, I own all these villages, and the people in them essentially work for me, in a sense. And what happens is, on Shvius, on Shemitah, they are working in my vineyards. They're basically hoeing in the vineyards, and as payment, I'm paying them with olives. And this is all happening on Shemitah. We're going to see in a second, we're going to ask, wait, how can he be hoeing during Shemitah? Okay, we'll see that in a second. But basically the question is that he's paying these workers with Shemitah olives, which means that he's not making them hefker, he's using them to pay his workers. Orich or lo orich, and he's asking Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok, is that acceptable or not? Can I pay these workers with the olives, with the Shemitah olives? Amle lo orich. Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok says, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that. Havakal Shavik Leva Ozil, and this fellow was leaving Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok. Omar, and Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok said, Kadu havisi dairi ba'ara hadom em shnin. Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok says, look, I've been living here for 40 years. V'lo chamisi bar inish mahalik ba'orchen disaknon kadein. And I've never met such an upstanding fellow, such a great, somebody who's walking in such a proper path like this fellow who just asked this kasha. And then this fellow came back and he says to Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok, wait, so what should I do then? If I can't pay them with the olives, then what should I do? Make the olives hefker for the poor people, and pay the people working in the vineyard with, pay them cash, pay them money. But one second, how could you hoe a vineyard on Shemitah? We learn in the Brisa that on the seventh year you have to leave it alone and abandon it. You have to leave the field alone, do not hoe it. And you have to abandon it, do not be removing any rocks from the field. Rav Ukva Bar Chama says there's actually two types of hoeing. There's two ways you can hoe a field, l'maaseh. One way of hoeing a field is to fill in cracks, because if the roots of the tree are exposed and they get cracks in them, so then the tree can die. The other thing you can do is to kind of put holes in the dirt to kind of keep the dirt soft, because that's better for the tree. So avruye ilne aser, so to put holes in the dirt and soften up the dirt so that the tree grows starker, so that's aser. because you're working the land on Shemitah. Sasume pile shari, but to just fill in cracks, and if there are exposed roots, and you want to make sure that they don't dry out and crack, and the tree's going to die, so you can do that on Shemitah, and that's what they were doing, and that's what he was paying them for. Amar Evo Mishum Rabbi Elazar bar Tzaddik, says Evo in the name of Rabbi Elazar bar Tzaddik. Al Yahalich Adam ba'Erev Shabbos Yosem Megimon Parsos. A fellow should not travel on Erev Shabbos more than 3 parses. Amar of Kahana lo Amarna El Leveise, and says of Kahana that is only to travel back to his house. If he's planning to go back home, he shouldn't travel more than 3 parsos on an Erev Shabbos, because they didn't have telephones back then, apparently, and so the people at home, they don't know, they're not necessarily expecting that he's going to come back. If he's far away, they're not necessarily expecting, it's Friday, he's not back yet, they know he's far away. They're not expecting and counting on him to come home for Shabbos, and then they're not going to be making food for him, and then he's going to come home and he's going to be upset. So to avoid that situation, just don't travel more than 3 parsos, it's like 5-6 miles or something, to your house on Erev Shabbos. But to go to some kind of guest house, so no problem. Whatever food you have with you, you'll take to the guest house, right? Right? You were assuming anyways that you'd be supplying your own food, Darton. So that would be okay. Those who say Omer of Kana, says of Kana, says of Kana, no, actually, even if he's going to his own house where he owns all the food and it's all his, still he shouldn't go back if it's more than 3 parsos away. And certainly not to a guest house where he doesn't own anything there. Certainly he shouldn't be going there. Alright, fine. Says of Kahana that he actually had this experience, that I guess one time he was Erev Shabbos and he was more than 3 parsos away, and he went and he traveled home and there was pasha no food for him to eat. Couldn't even find some fried fish. Alright. Mitzvah's lulav keitzad. So we said, how does the mitzvah, so going back to the Mishnah, so how did this mitzvah of lulav work? They would bring their lulav to the Har HaBayis and Erev Shabbos, and they would take the lulav and put them on the roof of there were like benches around the Har HaBayis, and they would put the lulavim on the roof of the benches. Tani Tana Kamadu of Nachman, so a certain teacher of Brises taught in front of Nachman. Sojan al Gaga Itztaba. They would take the lulavim and they would lay them out on the roof of these benches. On top of the benches there were roofs, and they would put the lulavim on top of the roofs. Rav Nachman says, what? They're going to get dried out. We know that lulav yavish is possible. Why would you put them on the roofs in the sun? No, rather they would put it on top of the benches themselves. Amar Rochbe, Amar Yehuda, Har HaBayis Tav Kaful Stav Lifnei Mistav. That says Rochbe in the name of Rabbi Yehuda that on Har HaBayis there were two layers of benches. There would be 1 layer of benches, and then around that would be another, like 2 rows of benches surrounding Har HaBayis, 1 inner and 1 outer. All right, sounds nice. That was Daf Mem Daled, Daf 44 of Masechta Sukkah. So we learned about the Arava. We had a half minute to say that maybe if the 7th day of Sukkot falls out on a Shabbos, maybe in Eretz Yisrael, where they know that it's for sure the 7th day, they should be able to do the mitzvah of Arava. That was the Shaila. So we say, no, we don't do that, because since in Bavel, it's a Sveika Diyoma, so we wouldn't do the mitzvah of Arava on Shabbos. So also in Eretz Yisrael, they also don't do the mitzvah of Arava on Shabbos. Then we said, wait, but I thought we said that when the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos in Eretz Yisrael, where they know that it's really the first day of Sukkot, they would take the lulav. So we say no. Actually, in Eretz Yisrael also, they do not take the lulav on the first day of Sukkot when it falls out on Shabbos. Okay? Then we wanted to know how come, right? Abaye asks Rabbah, how come that the lulav, we take the lulav all 7 days of Sukkot, Zeicher LeMikdash, yet we don't take the Arava all 7 days of Sukkot, Zeicher LeMikdash, only 1 day. So Rav Zvid says in the name of Rava, first he wanted to say that Rava is only midrabanan, which we said is not true. That the answer is because since there's a mitzvah of lulav even outside of the Beis Hamikdash, i.e. in the first day, so then lulav we do as a zeicher, as a remembrance to the Beis Hamikdash, we do it for all 7 days. But arava, which is limited in scope entirely to the Beis Hamikdash, there's no mitzvah of arava midoraisa outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, we don't do it for 7 days. Seicher lemikdash. Okay. Then we had a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi about is the mitzvah of arava a minig neviim or a yesod neviim. Now, of course, we know that says Rabbi Yochanan that arava in the Beis Hamikdash at least is midoraisa. So we're talking about outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Is it a minig neviim? I assume that's what it's saying. That this machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is outside of the Beis Hamikdash, and is it a minig or is it a takana of the neviim? And the nafkamina would be if it's a takana, an enactment, then you would actually make a bracha on it. So Rabbi Yochanan says that it's an enactment, a takana of the neviim, a yesod neviim, whereas Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says that it's a minig on neviim. It's a practice. It's just like a minig, not a enactment, but sort of something that they would do. And we saw that both Evo said the name of Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok, as well as we saw that Rav as well. They would assume that it's a minig on neviim, and they wouldn't make a bracha on the arava. We then said that the arava for the mitzvah of arava has to have a certain size. We said, what is that size? Rav Nachman says you have to have 3 twigs with fresh, moist leaves on them. Rav Shesha says you just need 1 twig with 1 leaf on it, and that would be acceptable. All right, fine. Beseder. Then at the very end we talked about we had this interesting distinction when it comes to Shemitah about hoeing a vineyard. You'd be allowed to hoe your vineyard to protect the vines from drying out and dying, but you wouldn't be allowed to sort of support them by fixing up the soil. And then we said that, in our Mishnah, we said that they would put the lulavim on the roof of that was on top of the benches on Har HaBayis. For Nachman pointed out, but then they'll dry out, and lulav yavish is possible. So actually, they would just put them on top of the benches themselves, so that they would be protected by the roofs. Alright, Cheved, that was Daf Mem Daled, Daf 44 of Masechta Sukkah. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Cheers.